In the 1800s, public asylums were put in place to care for the mentally ill of America. The original idea of asylums was good. They wanted to provide a safe place to nurse the mentally ill back to health. However, they quickly turned into terrible places due to abusive and inadequate conditions. The rights of the mentally ill were stripped away due to irresponsible doctors and nurses who ran or worked at the asylums, who were either oblivious to or did nothing about these abuses. Thousands suffered from within asylum walls, including a woman named Elizabeth Packard. However, Elizabeth used her experiences to advocate for a change. She used her stories to pressure the government into correcting the perennial horrific conditions of the mentally ill and protect their human rights in America by writing about her experiences in an Illinois insane asylum, which highlighted the failure of the government to fulfill their responsibilities to provide ethical treatment. Her efforts resulted in majorly improved facilities for those suffering from mental disabilities. This is the story of how one woman fought for the rights of women across the country and the mentally ill. The history of asylums goes back long before Elizabeth Packard. Before asylums, the mentally ill were cared for at home, similar to how a physically sick person would be cared for today. However, some mentally ill individuals were violent or disruptive as a result of their condition and needed additional, specialized care. This prompted hospitals to open asylums for mentally ill patients. Early asylums prioritized kindness and quietness in treatment, as it was believed those qualities would appeal to the rational part of the brains of the mentally ill, subsequently curing them of their ailments. Although it was not the perfect solution, this initially was not a bad approach. However, come the 1800s in America, state-run asylums, which were the most common, were not being properly supported by the government. Rather than focusing on asylums and the mentally ill, the government was more concerned with the prospect of a civil war as tension between states grew. This lack of governmental attention meant that doctors and nurses were free to run these asylums however they wanted, without any backlash. As a result, doctors and nurses put very little effort into running these asylums properly, allowing for abuses to happen. The mentally ill inside asylums were isolated, choked, beaten, and sometimes even killed by their caretakers. Asylums were additionally overcrowded, as well as filthy because patients rarely had the resources to practice basic hygiene. These are the conditions which Elizabeth Packard experienced when she was brought to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane, also known as the Jacksonville Insane Asylum, in 1860. There was one very curious thing about Elizabeth Packard's case, though. She was not actually insane. She had been committed to the asylum by her husband, Theophilus Packard, who wanted to silence her. In addition to being her husband, Theophilus was the pastor of Elizabeth's church. However, Elizabeth did not agree with the church's doctrine and left the congregation, much to her husband's embarrassment. To save his reputation, Theophilus explained that his wife was insane and did not actually disagree with his church's teachings, even though this was untrue. As a result, people whom Elizabeth had trusted and even called friends broke into her house and forcefully took her to the asylum, where she would spend the next 3 years. She was admitted without question. Back then, women were admitted to asylums for a variety of reasons, from actually being insane to simply having an interest in reading books. Because Elizabeth was not actually ill, she was able to log all the abuses that happened within the asylum. She observed that the asylum was overcrowded and dirty. Wards were never cleaned, and patients were hardly ever able to bathe. Sewage was rarely flushed away, causing the wards to smell dreadful. She recorded the physical abuses as well. She witnessed patients being choked, beaten, wrestled into straitjackets, and plunged under freezing cold water. Some patients died after such harsh treatment, while others committed or attempted suicide because of the horrific conditions. Elizabeth told her doctor, Dr. Andrew McFarland, about all these abuses she noticed. Sadly, he did barely anything to help. Because of this, Elizabeth secretly took notes of everything that was happening, writing on scraps of fabric or paper and hiding what she had written in her clothing. Eventually, she convinced McFarland to allow her to have real paper, and began to draft her first book, The Great Drama. Additionally, during her time in the asylum, Elizabeth advocated for her release, as she did not even belong in the hospital and could also help those who were truly ill more from outside asylum walls. However, McFarland was in correspondence with Theophilus Packard, who was devoted to keeping his wife locked in the insane asylum forever. Years passed, but eventually Elizabeth caused McFarland so much trouble that he wanted her out of the hospital. He released her, deeming her incurably insane. Elizabeth returned home, much to the annoyance of her husband, who wanted her locked away for life. As he began to make arrangements with another asylum to forever imprison Elizabeth, he locked her away in their bedroom. At this time, it may have been legal for a husband to imprison his wife in an insane asylum, but it was not legal for him to imprison his wife in her own home. Elizabeth managed to slip a note from her window to a friend, who alerted the local authorities to Elizabeth's plight. The Packards were brought to court, and Elizabeth won the case. She would not be locked away in another asylum. Afterwards, Elizabeth tried to file for a divorce, but her husband was determined to stay married to Elizabeth. In the end, due to limited rights of women and mental health patients at this time, Elizabeth stayed legally married to him, but they lived in separate homes. Winning this court case against her husband was only the beginning of Elizabeth Packard's victories regarding the rights of women and the mentally ill. In addition to publishing the great drama, Elizabeth wrote and published several other books to bring attention to the rights of women and the mentally ill. She helped to pass laws protecting women from being institutionalized when they were not actually insane. Although her work may have not immediately changed asylums, it inspired others to take action. As more and more people became aware of the problems women and the mentally ill were facing, they demanded change. Reform was now inevitable. Over the next few decades, drastic changes were made to how women and the mentally ill were treated. Women gained more rights, such as the right to vote. The mentally ill began to receive better care as abusive treatments were either banned or became obsolete. Eventually, asylums were done away with altogether. Modern treatment for the mentally ill is much better than it was in Elizabeth Packard's time. Because of Elizabeth Packard's contributions in the 1860s, the mentally ill gained rights and society began to accept their responsibility to care for individuals of all abilities and backgrounds.